Hey everyone, and welcome back to my channel. So in today's video I'm going to be doing a bit of a series update. So I thought I would go through all of the series that I've finished this year, all the series that I still need to complete, and then a few series that I'm thinking of DNFing, but I'm not quite sure. So far this year, I think, if I've counted right, I've completed 5 series, which I'm happy with, but also I feel like I could improve on that for the second half of the year. So I'm actually thinking of doing a thing where from September onwards, I don't start any new series and I dedicate the end of the year to completing some series. So I think I'm going to start by going through the series that I have actually completed this year, starting with The Bear and the Nightingale, or the Winter Night trilogy by Catherine Arden. So The Bear and the Nightingale is the first book in the series, and I finished this back in January. I think it was one of those series where I was meant to finish it in December and then I didn't get around to the last book in time. So technically this is the first series that I completed this year, and I really enjoyed it. It's a historical fantasy that follows a young girl called Vasya, and Vasya has this ability to see these spirits. There's a lot of Russian mythology and folklore in this series, and I really liked that. It's very atmosphere driven, and so I think that if you like fantasy books that do have a lot of atmosphere and that do have very beautiful writing, then I would recommend this series. I gave the first book 4 stars, and then I think the second book I gave like 3.5, but I rounded it up, and then I think the third book again I gave like 3.5. So I wouldn't say that it's my favourite series of all time, but I did really enjoy it. And yeah, if you like historical fantasies, then I definitely think it's worth giving a go. The second series that I finished this year was the Daughter of Smoke and Bone trilogy by Laini Taylor. So this first book follows a girl called Karu who lives in Prague, but she has this double life where she was basically raised by this chimera called Brimstone, I think his name is. I think this is described as a portal fantasy because it's partly set in our world, but then it's also set in this other world, and there's also a very strong romance that's running through it. The first book in this series I think I gave 4 stars, and then the second book I gave 3.5 stars, or maybe I did give it 4 stars, and then the third book I gave again like a 3.5. So I enjoyed this series and I would recommend it, but I didn't love it as much as Laini Taylor's other series, Strange the Dreamer. I think my main issue with this series was that I didn't feel 100% invested in the romance. I don't actually know whether this is categorised as young adult or adult, and I felt like it was more young adult in comparison to Strange the Dreamer, even though there are certain themes and certain topics that are explored in the book that are more adult. I wouldn't say that this is one of my all-time favourite series, but I did really enjoy it, and I will continue to read Laini Taylor's books if she does come out with anything else. The next series that I finished was the Daevabad trilogy by S.A. Chakraborty, and so the first book in this series is The City of Brass, that follows a young woman called Nari who lives in Egypt, and I think this is set a couple of 100 years ago. I'm not entirely sure exactly when it's meant to be set, but Nari works as a con artist, and she also has this healing ability. But at the very start of book 1, she's performing this con and she accidentally summons a Jinn warrior who ends up sweeping her away on this magical journey to the city of Daevabad, which is the home of the Jinn, because obviously Nari shouldn't have been able to summon a Jinn, but the fact that she could means that there's something else going on there, and so they obviously want to investigate it. And it ends up getting very political because there's also another perspective that you're following of the Prince of Daevabad. If you like political fantasies, then I would 100% recommend this series. It's one of my all-time favourite fantasy series. I gave every single book 5 stars, which doesn't happen very often, but I really loved the character development and the world building and all of the politics. Like, I've already said this, but the politics in this series, so good, so well done. And yeah, it was one of those series where I read the first book and then I finished it and immediately I had to read the second book, and then I finished the second book and I had to read the third book. And these are not small books. I think that they're all over about 600-700 pages, and I finished all 3 within the space of about 2 weeks because I was obsessed. The next series that I finished was the Brown Sisters series by Talia Hibbert, and I don't know whether I should count this because technically each of these books can be read as a standalone, but they're all part of the same series. Like, each book follows a different sister, so I'm going to count it because I want to be able to add another completed series to my list, but I love this series. It's an adult romance series that's kind of rom-com style. So as I said, you follow a different sister and their romances, but the first book is Get a Life Chloe Brown, and that follows the oldest sister Chloe. And at the start of the book, she has this near-death experience, and it prompts her to make a list of things that she wants to do to get a life. Basically, she looks back on her life and she thinks, what have I actually achieved? And one of the first things that she wants to do is move out, and she ends up moving into this building where the superintendent is this very handsome guy that she ends up roping into helping her to tick off these items from her list of things that she wants to do. And it's a romance, so you can probably guess what happens. I think of the 3 books in this series, my favourite was probably Eve Brown. However, I did really enjoy Danny Brown and Chloe Brown, to be fair. I think that of the 3 sisters, Danny is probably my favourite, but overall as a book as a whole, I did really love Eve Brown. I think what I loved most about this series though was the diversity and the way that Talia Hibbert writes the romances and the relationships. Talia Hibbert knows how to write good chemistry between characters, and so I would really like to go back and read some of her other books. Even though I know that this is her most popular series, I have heard really good things about her other books too. The final series that I completed this year was The King of Scars duology by Leigh Bardugo. So these are books 6 and 7 in the Grishaverse, I want to say. I think that's right. So I don't know whether to count these as a separate series. I mean, I am going to count them as a separate series because I want to be able to tick another series off my list. Not gonna lie, I didn't love this duology as much as I wanted to. I always say that the Grisha trilogy and the Six of Crows duology is what got me back into reading fantasy last year, and so it does have a special place in my heart and in my memories, but this book in particular was just not great. The plot felt a little all over the place, and even though I do still love Leigh Bardugo's writing and I did still love the characters, there were certain things to do with the plot that I just didn't really like, and also there was a big part of this book that just was so boring, and I never thought that that would happen with a Leigh Bardugo book. So yeah, this was not the best, but I mean, I did still like Rule of Wolves, to be fair. I think I gave this a 2.5 stars and I gave this a 3.5 stars. I do actually have a spoiler-filled reading vlog for both of these books. If you wanted to check it out, I'll leave it linked down below and in the cards. But yeah, I'm glad that I'm up to date with this series now, but these were just a little bit disappointing. Why did I decide to film this on the hottest day of the year? So in this next section, I'm going to go through the series where I'm up to date. So I've read all of the books that are currently out in these series, but there are more books to come, so I will have to continue them at some point. But the first of those series is Ninth House by Leigh Bardugo. I don't know if that's actually the name of the series. I think the series name is actually the Alex Stern series. I might be completely wrong, but this is a dark academia series that follows a character called Alex Stern who's accepted into Yale University, but part of the condition of her acceptance is that she has to monitor these secret societies that can use different types of magic. Then there's also a murder mystery, so a girl in the local town is found murdered and Alex has to investigate to see whether one of these secret societies is responsible. Really enjoyed this first book and I definitely want to continue this series. It's very dark and there are a lot of trigger warnings, so just something to be aware of. It's very different to the Grishaverse, but I love Leigh Bardugo's writing and I love the way that she can surprise me. So this does have a very slow build up, I would say, and there were parts where I was a little bit confused because there's 2 different perspectives but also 2 different timelines, and so it took a while for me to piece everything together in my mind, but the ending definitely made up for it and I'm really excited to see where it goes next. The next series that I am currently up to date on is the A Court of Thorns and Roses series by Sarah J Maas. This is technically book 4 in the series, or book 5 if you count the novella. So for anyone who doesn't know, the A Court of Thorns and Roses, or A Court of Thorns and Roses, the A Court of Thorns and Roses, what am I saying? A Court of Thorns and Roses follows a young woman called Feyre who accidentally kills a Fey shifter, and as punishment she has to go and live in the fairy kingdom, and that's the basic premise of the first book, but the books do deviate quite a lot from that, and by this book you're following Feyre's sister and it's a fantasy romance. So glad I'm up to date with this. No idea actually when the next book in this series is going to come out, but I think there's going to be 2 more books from what I understand. Another fantasy romance series that I am currently up to date on is the From Blood and Ash series by Jennifer L. Armentrout, and this book is really, really heavy. I don't know whether it's because it's self-published or indie published, but it's a lot heavier than a standard paperback, and also it is quite thick. But this follows a young woman called Poppy, who is the maiden. So in this society where she lives, certain people go through something called an ascension, and Poppy is being kept pure until her ascension. So she's very heavily guarded and she's not allowed to experience any kind of pleasure. No one's even allowed to look at her until her ascension, which will happen on her 19th birthday, I want to say. But Poppy is a bit of a rebel. She enjoys hanging out with her guards, and they have trained her how to fight and things like that. So the story really gets going when she's assigned a new guard called Hawk, and it's a fantasy romance, so you can probably guess what happens. I did enjoy this first book. I found it a little predictable. There were certain twists that I saw come in. Kingdom of Flesh and Fire is still my favourite, so the second book is my favourite in the series so far. I did generally enjoy Crown of Gilded Bones, which came out earlier this year. However, I was a little disappointed in that it did feel very, very info dumpy. So I will continue this series. I think there's a prequel trilogy that's coming out later this year. I'm pretty sure that I've heard actually that there's going to be something like 9 books or 12 books in this series, so it's going to take me a while to get through them all, but I do like the characters in this series, so I think I will continue it. The next series that I am currently up to date with is the Kiss Quotient series by Helen Huang. I think that's the name of the series, is the Kiss Quotient series. The first book is called The Kiss Quotient, and then the second book is The Bride Test. There is a third book called The Heart Principle that comes out, I think it's either this month or next month. So I won't be up to date on this series for much longer, but I do plan on reading The Heart Principle very, very soon because I do like this series. It's very steamy, but also very cute, and I really like the representation in these books as well. Next on my list is The Bone Shard Daughter by Andrea Stewart, and I can't remember what the name of this series is. I think it's The Drowning Empire. I might be wrong, but I'm pretty sure that's what it is. And The Bone Shard Daughter is the first book in this series, which came out last year, I think it was. I think the second book comes out later this year. And I read The Bone Shard Daughter a couple of months ago, I think it was. And I was really surprised by how much I enjoyed it because the magic system in this world is really, really cool. The first book kind of introduces you to this world where the Emperor basically uses something called bone shard magic to create these constructs that are animal-like, and they help him to rule over this empire and to maintain law and order. And you're following the Emperor's daughter, who has issues with her memory, and the Emperor has basically said that until she can learn how to use bone shard magic again, then she's not going to be able to inherit the throne. There's also a few other characters that you follow around this world. So the structure of this world, if you look at the map, there's all of these different islands, and there's a lot of unrest among the people because a lot of people aren't happy with the way that the Emperor is running things. As I might have said, I was really surprised by how much I enjoyed the first book, and especially towards the end it went in a direction that I really, really didn't see coming, and so I'm really excited to see how the series continues. The final book within this section is The Shadow of the Gods by John Gwynne, which I don't actually know what the name of the series is. I think it's The Shadow of the Gods. I really should have prepared more for this video, but The Shadow of the Gods is an epic adult high fantasy book that follows 3 different perspectives, and it's set in this world where the land used to be ruled by these gods, but the gods were very destructive, and before they became extinct they almost destroyed this world, and so a lot of people are scared of these gods, and a lot of people are still scared of the descendants of these gods. And yeah, you follow these 3 different perspectives, and just in general, the way that I like to describe the vibe of this book is that there's a lot of bloodthirsty battle scenes. It's a Nordic inspired fantasy as well, so Vikings and stuff like that. It's really, really good. I really, really enjoyed it. This is actually the first book that I ever read by John Gwynne, but I would like to give his other series a go. I think I've actually got the first book actually in his other series, The Faithful and The Fallen, so I'm hoping to get around to that eventually too. Okay, so if the camera angle has changed slightly, it's because for some reason I thought that I could get through this video without any water and with my hair down, when it is literally the hottest day of the year so far, and I am melting. So moving on, the next section that I wanted to go through is the series that I still need to continue, where there are actually books that are out and that have been released. I just haven't got round to them yet. So there's 13 books or 13 series in total that I'm going to go through, starting with The Diviners by Libba Bray. This is a historical fantasy that's set in the 1920s in New York, and it follows a few different characters that have these different abilities. I really enjoyed the first book in this series. I think I read it back in November, I want to say, and I was surprised by how much I liked it. I think I gave it 5 stars. So it's a series that I definitely do want to continue. I've heard really good things about the second book in the series, and I think I've heard a few people say that the third book was okay, but then I haven't heard very good things about the last book in this series. So I don't know. I think that's put me off just a little bit, but because I did love the first book so much, I would like to continue it. And I have heard actually that the audiobooks are really good, so I might go down that route maybe, but I think it's one of those series where I do want to continue it soon because I don't want to forget what happened in the first book. The next series on my list is the Darker Shade of Magic series by V. Schwab. I read this first book earlier this year. I think I read it for Becca's 48-hour bookoplathon, and it was a really good book to read for the readathon because it's very fast paced and I read it quite quickly. I think what I liked most about this first book was the world building. So it's set in this world where you have these different parallel Londons. So you have Grey London, I think is our world, and then you have Red London, which has magic, and then White London, where magic is starting to disappear and where it's become out of control, and then you have Black London, which is dead because it was consumed by magic. I think I've got all of those the right way round, but I really enjoyed this first book. I gave it 4 stars, and so I would like to continue because I've heard really good things about the second book. The next series that I need to continue is the Eddie Flynn series by Steve Kavanagh. So this is one of those series where each book could be read as a standalone, but they all follow the same main character. So this character of Eddie Flynn, who is a lawyer but used to be a con artist. So did I mention that this is a crime courtroom thriller series? I really loved 13 in this series. I've been reading the books out of order, so I started with book 4, I think it was, and then I also read book 5, 50/50, earlier this year. Really enjoyed both of them. I gave them both 5 stars. I have heard that the earlier books in this series aren't as good, but I think I actually own book 1 and 2 on my Kindle, so I would like to read them at some point. The next series on my list is the Grip trilogy by Kennedy Ryan, and this is an adult contemporary romance series. I read the first book, which is a really short novella, earlier this year, and I did really like Kennedy Ryan's writing style, and I felt like I would have enjoyed the full-length novel more. It's all available on Kindle Unlimited, and I do have a KU subscription, so I thought I might as well continue and finish off the series, especially because I really liked the way that Kennedy Ryan wrote the chemistry between the 2 main characters. I think there's a good potential for me to really enjoy the second and third book. Next on my list is the Dark Iceland series by Ragnar Jonasson, and I read the first book in this series earlier this year for Eurovision-a-thon. That's it, because this book was, and this series was originally published in Iceland, and so it's been translated into English, and I have a bit of a thing for books that are set in Iceland. I really love Iceland in general as a country. It's one of my favourite countries that I've ever visited, and so any book that is set there and that can make me feel like I'm back there, I really like that. I think I would describe this series as a cosy crime mystery series. So Ragnar Jonasson has actually translated a lot of Agatha Christie's books into Icelandic, and I could definitely see how the first book in this series had the vibes that I would associate with an Agatha Christie novel, which might not make a lot of sense because I've never actually read an Agatha Christie book, but the vibes felt similar to me, and so I would really like to continue the series. I'm not sure how many books are in this series, but I think as well that the order is different for the English translations in comparison to the original series that was obviously published in Icelandic, so I need to double check that I am reading the books in order and so I don't get spoilers. Next on my list is the Girls of Paper and Fire series by Natasha Nian. So I read the first book in this series, I think it was last month or the month before, and I really enjoyed it. I would say that it's probably one of my favourite YA fantasy books, at least that I've read in the last few years, and I've heard mixed things about the second book, but the third book comes out later this year, and so I would like to continue the series and finish it off because I did give the first book 5 stars. This book is set in a world where you have this caste system, so you have the paper caste who are human, and then you also have the demon caste, which I think is called the moon caste. I'm a little hazy on the details, it's been a few weeks since I read it, but we're following a human girl called Lei who is forced to become a paper girl. So the paper girls are essentially the king's concubines, and the story is essentially about how Lei deals with the situation that she's in. There's a sapphic romance throughout this series which I really enjoyed. There's also quite a lot of trigger warnings, so just something to be aware of. It does get quite dark in places even though it is technically classed as a young adult book. Next on my list is the Mistborn series by Brandon Sanderson. So I read The Final Empire last month and fell in love, to be honest. This has become one of my all-time favourite fantasy books. I loved the magic system in this. It's so cool. So this book is set in a world where the Dark Lord won. So for the past 1,000 years, this empire has been ruled by this evil Dark Lord, and we're following a group of allomancers who are trying to take down this Dark Lord. So the magic system in this world is based around metal. These allomancers can use different types of metal to get magical abilities, and some people can ingest all of the metal and get all of the abilities, and they are called Mistborn. And the two main characters in this are called Calcia and Vin, and they are both Mistborn. Really excited to continue this series, although I have heard that with books 2 and 3 I'm probably going to want to read them back to back, and so I'm going to try and find a good time where I can do that, because when I finished this book it took a lot for me to not immediately pick up the second book, and I don't want to get that feeling again. So when I read The Well of Ascension is the second book, I think I'm going to have the next book, Hero of Ages, lined up ready to go so I can read them straight after each other. The next series that I would really like to continue is the Dead Djinn in Cairo series by P. Jelly Clark. I'm not sure actually what the official name of that series is, but I read A Dead Djinn in Cairo a few weeks ago, I think it was. It might have been last month, and really enjoyed it. Considering that it's such a short novella, I thought the world building and the character development within that short space of time was done really well, and it's definitely left me intrigued. It's set in Cairo, I think in the 1920s, and you're following a detective who's investigating after a dead djinn has been found. So a dead djinn in Cairo, basically. I know that there are a couple of other novellas in this series, and then the full-length novel, A Master of Djinn, I think is called, that came out early this year, so I would like to get around to that too. Next on my list is the Farseid trilogy by Robin Hobbs. So this is the first book in the Realm of the Elderlings series, and the way that the series is structured is that you have the overarching series that's set in this same world, but then it's also broken up into smaller series. So the Farseid trilogy is basically the first series within the Realm of the Elderlings, if that makes sense. And this follows a young boy called Fitz, who is the bastard son of the Crown Prince. And basically in this first book you follow Fitz as he's trained to become the royal assassin. He's an assassin in the sense that he learns how to be more subtle and more of a spy, and how to use poisons rather than being like an assassin that I would typically imagine. I don't know if I'm doing a very good job of explaining the plot of this book, but this is a very character-driven book, and it's very slow-paced. It's also got a very unique writing style because it has a very high fantasy writing style, but it's told in the first person. And so I did half and half with this book. I read it physically, but then I also listened to part of it as an audiobook, and I did really like the audiobook. The setting feels historical. It feels almost like old England. So if you like the idea of a fantasy series that has that kind of vibe, then I would recommend giving this a go. It's very, very sad though. That is the only thing. Like the general tone of the book, it did feel very emotionally draining. That is the only thing that I would say. However, I do want to continue this series because I'm definitely intrigued by the magic in this world and also the politics. I don't know if I've said that already, but this is a very political fantasy and that's my kind of thing. I love political fantasies. Next on my list is the Beartown series by Fredrik Backman. I think the second book in this series is called Us Against You. I might have that completely wrong, but when I first read this book, I didn't actually realise that it was the first book in a series, but there is a sequel, and so I would like to read that because I did like the first book. This is contemporary fiction or literary fiction. Fredrik Backman is a Swedish author, and so this was originally published in Swedish and then translated into English. It's a very character-driven book that focuses on this hockey town where the people have put a lot of pressure on the local hockey team, and I will say that there is a trigger warning for the first book, so just something to bear in mind if you are thinking of reading it. I don't want to say the trigger warning because I don't know whether some people would consider that a spoiler. I really like Fredrik Backman's writing and I would really like to finish off this series. I think there's going to be a third book actually, but I'm not sure when that's going to come out. Another series that I would like to continue is the Song of Ice and Fire Game of Thrones series by George R.R. Martin. Now technically I have read this series before, but I can't remember how far into it I got, so I decided to start rereading it last year, and I read the first book via audio, and then I also listened to the second book in this series last month, I think it was. Are there 5 books in this series so far? I'm not 100% sure, but I know that for some of the books, because they're quite long, in the UK the paperbacks have been split into 2, and so I think that's where I got confused last time, because I thought that I was 5 books into this series, but I'm not sure whether I read the 5 books that are out or whether I read the first 5 halves of the series, if that makes sense. But yeah, I would like to continue this series and make sure that I am up to date before Winds of Winter comes out, but who knows when that is actually going to happen. Another series that I would like to continue is The Book of Dust by Philip Pullman. So I read La Belle Sauvage back in, I think it was February 2020. I don't know why I'm being so specific there, but I read the first book in this series and I thought it was okay, but the way that this series is structured is that the first book is a prequel to the His Dark Materials series, which was one of my favourite series when I was growing up, but then the second book I believe is a sequel, so I am interested in giving the sequel a go. I have heard very mixed opinions on it, and because it's quite a large book, I feel like it's going to take me a while to get the motivation to actually read it, but I have seen that my library does have a copy of it, so I would like to give it a go eventually. It's just working out my priorities. And then the final series within this section is The Poppy War by R.F. Kuang. So I have read the first 2 books in this trilogy, so I've only got 1 more left to go, and I am hoping to pick up The Burning God soon. I might actually read it next week, you know. I'm going to see how it goes, but I'm a little bit nervous about how this series is going to end, and I've heard mixed reviews. I am going to try and keep an open mind though, because when it came to The Poppy War, I did enjoy that book. I had a few issues, mostly with the world building and also the pacing throughout the book, because there were a few time jumps that felt a little bit jarring, but generally I did like it. And then when I read The Dragon Republic, I was just amazed. I really, really liked that book, and especially because it got a lot more political. It's also very, very dark in places, which I wanted to mention because there's quite a lot of trigger warnings, especially for the first book. Certain events are based on actual Chinese history, which I found really interesting and which I think it is important to know going into the books. So yeah, hopefully I will get around to The Burning God soon, and then that'll be another series that I can say that I've completed. Okay, so in this next section, I'm going to quickly go through some series where I think I'm going to DNF them. I think there's 5 series on my list, and I've read the first book in each of these, and in some cases did enjoy those first books, but I didn't give any of these books higher than 3 stars. Some of them I actually gave 2 stars, and so I'm not sure whether I do want to continue them and whether it's worth giving the next book a go. but the first series on my list is The Rosie Project by Graham Simpson. So this is a contemporary romance that's set in Australia, and I enjoyed the first book. I think I gave it 3 stars, but I've heard that the later books in the series aren't as good, and I think that because I didn't love that first book, I don't know whether it is worth continuing. The next series on my list is the Cruel Prince series by Holly Black, and again, I think I gave the first book 3 stars. I thought it was okay. It was entertaining, but I don't know whether I'm that interested in the characters to continue the series, because one of my main issues with the first book is that I didn't really like the romance and I didn't find it believable, and I've heard that the romance becomes more prominent in the later books, and so I don't know if I'm gonna enjoy that. The next series on my list, which I've just realised actually is behind me on my bookcase, so I should probably grab that, but it's the Crazy Rich Asians series by Kevin Kwan. So this is a rom-com series, and I thought this first book was okay. I really liked the film actually. I watched the film a few years ago. I was going to say that this followed the film quite closely, but it's the other way around. Like, the film I felt was a close adaptation of this, even though I watched the film first. Don't know if I'm making sense, but I liked this, but I struggled a little bit because it was very slow paced and I wasn't expecting it to be that slow paced. Also, this is deceptively long. I don't know if you're going to be able to see the writing, but the writing is really, really small. And so I was expecting to be able to finish this in a few days, and it took me, I think, nearly a week. I do actually own books 2 and 3 in this series on my Kindle, so I might give the second book a go, but I'd be really interested to hear from anyone who has read this full series, whether you think it is worth continuing, because this is probably the one where I'm the most unsure whether I do actually want a DNF. And then there are 2 other series on my list, which are series that I started last year, and then I actually decided to DNF them last year, but I wanted to mention them in this video because I wanted this video to be all of the series that I've started and that I've read since I started my channel, which was almost a year ago. So you've probably heard me talk about both of these series before, but I did read the first book in the Mortal Instruments series last year, so City of Bones, and I gave it 2 stars. Like, it was fine. I listened to the audiobook and I did think that the narrator did a good job, but I found the characters a little bit annoying, and also I found it really predictable. The twists towards the end, I mean, certain twists I didn't see coming, but there was certain things that happened within the book where to me it felt quite obvious that they were going to happen. I don't think this series is for me. However, I am wondering whether at some point I will pick up the Infernal Devices, because I know that that is historical in terms of the setting, and I do tend to prefer historical fantasies rather than contemporary fantasies, so I don't know. I might give it a go, but it's going to be low on the priority list. And then the final series that, again, I think I've mentioned a few times is the Caraval series by Stephanie Garber. I gave the first book 2 stars. I really didn't like the characters. I think that was my main issue that I had with it, and so I've decided not to continue. I have seen that there's a spin-off series to this series coming out. I think the first book comes out later this year. I've seen a few people have got arcs of it, and again, I don't think it's going to be for me. But yeah, I think that does bring me to the end of the video, so thanks for watching. If you've made it this far, let me know in the comments if you've read any of the series that I've talked about in this video, and let me know what you thought of them. And also, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up if you liked it, and click subscribe if you would like to see more videos from me, and I will see you next time. Bye.